My name is Sera, and at 21 years old, I watched everything my grandfather had built get divided up like furniture at a yard sale. And I was handed an old brass telescope and told to be grateful. The law office of Whitmore and Crane smelled of lemon polish and something older underneath it, something that reminded me of dusty courtrooms and slow, deliberate cruelty. The chairs were stiff and high-backed, arranged in a semicircle facing the great mahogany desk of Theodore Whitmore II, a man so precisely assembled he could have been manufactured. His silver cufflinks caught the morning light every time he shifted a page. I kept watching them. It was easier than watching my brothers. Callum sat to my left, his jaw set in that particular way he had, the way that said he already knew the outcome and was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. He was 28, a financial analyst, a man who had once explained to me at Christmas dinner that sentiment was the enemy of strategy. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than my monthly rent, and he had not once looked at me since we sat down. To his left was our brother Declan, 31, a real estate attorney whose specialty, with breathtaking irony, was inheritance litigation. He had his phone face down on his knee, and his fingers laced together over it, patient as a priest. I was the youngest. I was always the youngest. And in this family that meant I was also the least. A footnote in a story the older chapters had already written. Our grandfather, Arthur Voss, had died 3 weeks earlier. He was 79 years old, and up until his final year, he had been the sharpest man I had ever known. Sharp in the way a good knife is sharp, not for show, but because it was made to cut through things cleanly. He had built his fortune quietly, over decades, in ways that were so understated his own children had never fully grasped the scale of it. He owned land and timber interests in 4 states, a small maritime shipping concern he'd acquired in the 70s, and enough miscellaneous holdings that even Theodore Whitmore II needed a separate folder just to contain the index. He had also been my person, my favorite person in the world. From the time I was 6 years old until I left for college, I had spent every summer with him at his mountain retreat in the Blue Ridge, a place called Halverson Point. He taught me to identify stars. He taught me to keep a field journal. He taught me that the world revealed itself most honestly to the people who took the time to look at it carefully and quietly, without expecting it to perform. He had a brass telescope, an antique, German-made refractor from the 1920s, that he kept on a wooden tripod in the corner of his study. We used it constantly. He would set it up on the stone terrace on clear nights, and we would sit out until midnight in canvas chairs with thermoses of hot chocolate, and he would name things for me. Constellations, planets, the smudge of galaxies invisible to the naked eye. He said the telescope was how he learned to see the difference between what was simply there and what was actually important. I had not thought about that telescope in years, until Theodore Whitmore read its name aloud in a room that smelled of lemon polish and expectation. He began with the assets, as lawyers do. The maritime concern went to Declan. The timber holdings were divided equally between Callum and Declan. The primary family residence, a Georgian townhouse in Charlotte, went to Callum. The liquid assets, a number with enough zeros that I heard Callum exhale very softly through his nose, were split between them on a 60-40 arrangement, with Declan receiving the larger share in recognition of what Whitmore described, without apparent irony, as his demonstrated stewardship of the family's legal interests. The two of them were practically glowing. Not with happiness exactly, they were too controlled for that, but with a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from being validated on a grand scale. Declan straightened his cuffs. Callum made a single small note on the legal pad in front of him. They had expected this. They had planned for this. Probably they had planned for it for years. Then Theodore Whitmore turned the page, and his eyes moved to me. "To my granddaughter, Sera Elaine Voss," he read, his voice maintaining its perfect professional neutrality. "I leave my brass refractor telescope, serial number 1924-GR-047, and its accompanying tripod and field case as a remembrance of our shared evenings at Halverson Point. Silence. Callum's pen paused over his legal pad. Declan's eyes moved to the window. Neither of them looked at me. They were kind enough, in that particular cold way, not to let me see their faces while they processed their amusement. I heard Callum make a very small sound, a breath through the nose that might have been a laugh, suppressed before it became something too obvious to ignore. "Is that the entirety of the bequest for Miss Voss?" Declan asked. His tone was careful, moderate, professionally neutral. He had learned it from the same world that had shaped Whitmore. It was the tone of a man asking a formality, not a question. "In the primary instrument," Whitmore said. "Yes." Declan nodded as if that were perfectly reasonable, as if our grandfather had looked at 21 years of my life and concluded that the fair market value of all of it was one antique telescope. The hot shame that moved through me was something I recognized. I had felt it before, in smaller doses, at holiday dinners when my career choices were discussed in the tone adults use for politely tolerating a child's fantasy, at family functions where Callum and Declan's accomplishments were framed and hung on the conversational wall, while mine were noted briefly and moved past. This was that feeling amplified to a frequency I hadn't known it could reach. It moved through my chest like heat through metal. I kept my face still and my hands flat on my thighs. I did not cry. I signed where I was asked to sign. I accepted the small typed receipt, acknowledging the telescope and its accessories. I thanked Theodore Whitmore, which was perhaps excessive, but my grandmother had raised me to be polite in rooms where I was losing. Callum and Declan were already discussing dinner reservations when I gathered my bag and walked toward the door. "Sera." The voice stopped me at the threshold. I turned. Theodore Whitmore had come around his desk. He was holding two things: a cream-coloured envelope sealed with a disc of dark green wax and a small iron key on a plain ring. He held them out to me with both hands, formally, like an offering. "Your grandfather left specific instructions," he said. "These were to be given to you privately after the reading. Not before, not during. He was very precise about that." I looked at the envelope and the key. Something moved in my chest. A shift, like a gear catching. "What does the key open?" I asked. Whitmore's expression gave nothing away. I was not told. He said you would know what to do with the envelope, and that the key would make its purpose clear in time. I took them both. The envelope was heavy and substantial in my palm. The key was cold, solid, small. I closed my fingers around them. "He also said," Whitmore added, and here a very small, private softening came into the corners of his eyes, "that he was sorry he couldn't be there to see it. Whatever that means to you." I didn't trust my voice, so I nodded. I walked out of the office, down the carpeted stairs, past the receptionist, and out into the white autumn light of the street. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment with my grandfather's letter in one hand and his iron key in the other, and the sound of the city moved around me like water around a stone. I didn't open the envelope on the street. I drove to a small park 3 blocks from the office, pulled into a space beneath an oak that was losing its leaves in slow, golden handfuls, and sat with the engine ticking. The wax seal was a deep, resinous green. My grandfather had used the same colour on letters he sent me at university, birthday letters, mostly, and occasional packages containing articles he had clipped from journals he thought I should read. I broke the seal carefully, trying to keep the disc intact, and unfolded 2 sheets of paper. The handwriting was his, that precise, slightly angular script that hadn't changed since the oldest letter I'd ever seen from him, written in his 30s. It looked like a man who had decided how he would write and had seen no reason to revise that decision. The first thing on the page was not a greeting. It was a set of numbers, 2 groups, formatted with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime working with exactitude. Coordinates. Geographic coordinates, written in decimal degrees, north and south. Below them, a single line. Point it where it matters. I stared at it for a long time. My breath had gone shallow. I typed the coordinates into my phone's map application with careful fingers, double-checking each digit. The map loaded. The red pin dropped. I pinched the screen to zoom out, then in again, trying to understand what I was looking at. It was in the mountains, in the Blue Ridge, approximately 40 miles from Halverson Point, from the retreat where he and I had spent those summers. The pin sat in the middle of an area that registered on the satellite view as dense forest and elevation, a fold in the terrain so deep and surrounded by ridgeline that the valley floor wasn't visible. The nearest road was more than 2 miles away. No buildings were marked, no names, just contour lines and tree canopy, and the quiet indifference of wilderness that had never been logged or paved or developed. And then I understood what he meant. Not completely, not yet, but enough. I drove north. Halverson Point was not a large property. It sat on a ridge in the Blue Ridge Range at an elevation of roughly 3,100 feet, and it consisted of a modest stone and timber retreat house, a woodshed, a tool outbuilding, and the stone terrace where we used to set up the telescope on clear nights. My grandfather had owned it for over 40 years. In his will, the retreat itself had gone to Callum, categorized under residential properties and assigned without ceremony. Callum didn't know this place the way I knew it. He had come twice in his childhood, by his own account, and found it boring. There was no cell service. The nearest town was 40 minutes down a switchback road, and it had one gas station and a diner that closed at 2 in the afternoon. It was not a place that recommended itself to men who had dinner reservations to consider. The property manager, a weathered man named Gil who had been looking after the place for 15 years, met me at the gate. He looked surprised to see me, and then not surprised, and then he stepped back and said nothing, which is what Gil did when he understood something, but wasn't going to be the one to say it first. "Grandad's telescope," I said. "Did he leave it up here, or is it in Charlotte?" "Study," Gil said. "Right where it always was." The house was cold and smelled of wood smoke and old paper in the way it always did when it hadn't been opened in a few weeks. My grandfather's study was off the main hall, a small room lined with bookshelves and topographic maps in frames, and in the corner, standing on its wooden tripod exactly as I remembered, was the brass telescope. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at it. It caught the grey afternoon light from the window, its barrel a warm, oxidized gold, its lens cap in place. 60-some years old, and maintained with the care of a man who believed that beautiful instruments deserved to be kept beautiful. I walked over to it and rested my hand on the barrel. The metal was cold. I pulled out my phone and looked at the coordinates again. The valley they described was to the northeast. I was at 3,100 feet of elevation. From the stone terrace, on a clear day, the view to the northeast was unobstructed for miles, ridge after ridge, folding into the distance like the pages of a closing book. I picked up the tripod and carried it outside. The sky was overcast, a high, thin layer of cloud that diffused the light without blocking it entirely. It was the kind of light that doesn't favor stargazing, but does favor looking at landscape, soft and even, without glare. I set up the tripod on the terrace exactly where we used to set it for the night sky, and adjusted the legs for the angle of the stone. I had the coordinates. My grandfather's telescope was a 70mm refractor with a focal length long enough to pull distant things close. I checked the orientation on my phone's compass, adjusted the barrel's bearing to northeast, and calculated the elevation angle I'd need to aim into the valley between two specific ridgelines. Then I crouched behind the eyepiece and began to adjust. It took nearly 20 minutes of careful, incremental movement, small corrections to the bearing, small adjustments to the tilt, panning slowly across the dark line of distant forest where the valley should be. I had almost convinced myself I was wrong. that I had misread the coordinates or misunderstood the distance when the image in the eyepiece shifted past a break in the tree canopy and I stopped moving my hands. There, in a small clearing in the floor of the valley, was a house. Not a cabin, not a hunting lodge. A house, a substantial, handsome structure with a broad front face of pale stone and a slate roof that caught even the diffuse grey light of the overcast afternoon and gave it back with a quiet authority. It was surrounded on 3 sides by mature hardwoods that cupped it like hands, and before it lay an open meadow, wide and flat, that would be invisible from any angle except from directly above, or from the precise elevation and bearing I was currently occupying. A long gravel track wound away from the rear of the house into the tree line, but it emerged nowhere I could see. There were no utility poles visible, no other structures, no road markers, nothing that would draw the eye on a satellite map if you weren't looking at exactly the right coordinates. My hands were trembling slightly as I straightened up from the eyepiece. I looked out at the northeast ridge with my naked eyes. There was nothing there but forest and sky, and the grey-layered distances of mountain terrain. You could stand on this terrace for a lifetime and never know that tucked into a fold of that landscape, 2 miles away as the crow flies and invisible from every road and trail, was a stone house with a slate roof, sitting in its private meadow like a secret someone had been keeping for a very long time. I looked down at the small iron key in my palm. Getting to the valley took the rest of the afternoon. The gravel track I had seen through the telescope emerged eventually onto a single-lane fire road that wasn't on any public map. Gil knew of it, knew approximately where it started, and drove me 3 miles along a ridge in his truck before pointing at a gap in the trees that I would never have noticed on my own. The track beyond the gap was overgrown but intact, packed gravel under a season of fallen leaves, and it wound down into the valley in long, gentle switchbacks, as if it had been designed for something heavier than cars. We came out of the tree line and the house was simply there, the way things are when you've been shown where to look. It was larger than it had appeared through the telescope. 2 full stories of pale quarried stone, probably local sandstone with a wide covered porch running the length of the front face and tall 12-paned windows that were dark now, but whose proportions spoke of rooms with high ceilings and serious light. The slate roof was old but sound, the copper guttering verdigrised to a deep, beautiful green. The meadow grass in front was long and seeded out, moving in the thin mountain wind. There was a stone wellhead to one side, a timber barn set back to the east, and along the south face of the house, the skeleton of a dormant kitchen garden behind a low stone wall. It did not look abandoned. It looked like a house that was simply waiting. Gil stopped the truck at the edge of the clearing and turned off the engine. He looked at the house for a moment. "Been up here once," he said. "Maybe 15 years ago. Your grandfather had me drive some materials up. He was very specific that I wasn't to mention it to anyone." "Did you?" I asked. "He asked me not to," Gil said, as if that were the only answer the question could possibly have. I got out and walked across the meadow through the long grass. The porch steps were solid under my feet, the wood grey and weathered, but not soft. The front door was a heavy, dark-stained oak, fitted with iron hardware, and at its centre, at the precise height of a hand, was an iron lock plate with a keyhole. I already knew it would fit. Some part of me had known since the moment I looked at the key in Whitmore's office. But knowing a thing and experiencing it are different events, and when the small iron key slid into that lock and turned with a clean single motion, the bolt retracting with a deep, resonant clunk that I felt in my sternum, I had to stand still for a moment, with my hand on the key and my forehead nearly touching the door. Then I pushed it open. The interior smelled of stone and wood smoke and old timber. The particular cold cleanness of a space that has been maintained in the absence of occupants. The entry hall was wide, floored in wide plank oak that was darker at the centre from generations of foot traffic, and to the right, a staircase rose with simple, heavy balusters toward the upper floor. Straight ahead, through an open doorway, I could see the shape of a large main room with a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall. Everything was clean. Not cleaned recently, but maintained, dusted, covered where necessary with fitted canvas, the windows intact and the chimneys capped. Someone had been coming here. Not often, but regularly enough. Gil, who had followed me up the porch steps, looked around the entry hall with the quiet assessment of a man who took care of structures. "It's in good shape," he said, half to himself. "Better than it has any right to be." I walked through the main room and found what I was looking for on the mantelpiece of the stone fireplace. A single large envelope, cream-coloured, sealed with the same dark green wax, and on the front, my name in that familiar angular hand. Beside it, held flat by a small river stone, was a folded document. I picked it up first. It was a property deed, county recorded, properly stamped, legal and complete. The kind of document that has the weight of a thing that exists in the world. The property was described as Lot 7, Black Hollow Valley, Blue Ridge Mountain Range. The acreage listed made my breath catch, 240 acres. The deed was dated 11 months ago, recently enough that my grandfather had been in reasonable health when he signed it, not so recently that it suggested a deathbed decision. The name on the deed, as registered owner, was Sera Voss. I held it for a moment, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Then I set it down with the care it deserved and opened the envelope. "My dear Sera," it began, "if you're reading this, then you found the terrace and the valley and the door, which means you were paying attention. That is all I ever asked of anyone, and you are the only person in the family who ever actually did it. I want you to know that first, before anything else, you were always paying attention. I noticed. I was proud of it every time." I sat down on the stone hearth because my legs had gone uncertain. "I want to explain what I have done and why, because you deserve a full accounting, not a mystery. The house and land you are standing in have been mine since 1987, when I purchased them privately through a holding company I established for that exact purpose. The company's name would mean nothing to you. It has existed, quietly, for 37 years, owning this property and paying its taxes, completely separate from the Voss estate that Whitmore manages. I never disclosed it, because I never intended it to be part of that estate. I did not conceal it to deceive my family. I concealed it to protect it. And more specifically, to protect it for you. I have watched my grandsons grow into capable men, and I say that without sarcasm, because it is true. They are capable, and they are intelligent, and they will manage what I have left them with efficiency and competence. But I have watched them also become men for whom everything is a calculation, for whom a property is always an asset, for whom the question asked of any beautiful thing is always, what is it worth? Callum would sell this valley within a year. Declan would subdivide it. Neither of them would ever have thought to climb a ridge in the Blue Ridge Mountains, look through an old telescope, and try to understand what their grandfather was asking them to see. You would. You always would have. I have been certain of that since you were 8 years old, and you sat beside me on that cold terrace, and you didn't ask me what the telescope was worth. You asked me what it was looking at. I stopped reading for a moment. The mountain quiet was immense around me. Through the tall windows, the meadow had gone to that deep, saturated green of late afternoon before the light fails, and above the tree line the sky was a pale, achromatic grey that made the scene outside look like the opening of a story. I kept reading. The estate I left Callum and Declan is real and substantial, and they are welcome to it. I have no interest in punishing them for being who they are. But I want you to understand that what you are standing in is not a consolation prize. It is not the lesser thing I gave you because I didn't know what else to do. It is the opposite. It is the thing I valued most, and I gave it to the grandchild I trusted most to understand why it should be valued. This house was built in the 1880s by a man named Elias Compton, who quarried the stone himself from the hillside behind the barn. He built it to last, and it has lasted, and I have spent 37 years keeping it worthy of his work. The land around it has never been logged, never developed, never divided. There are black bears in the eastern woods, and a creek that runs all year on the north side of the property, and a meadow that, in June, fills with wild indigo and bee balm that you have to stand inside to fully believe. I have been here alone, many times. It is the place on earth where I have thought most clearly. I am giving it to you not because I want to balance some perceived injustice, but because I believe you will know what to do with a place like this. You will not immediately ask what it is worth. You will ask what it is. And then, when you have understood what it is, you will figure out what to do with it from a place of understanding rather than calculation. That is the only way anyone should ever inherit anything. The deed is filed and clear. The holding company's assets, the property and a fund I have maintained to cover its taxes and maintenance in perpetuity, transfer to you directly. Whitmore has a sealed copy of these arrangements that he will present to you if there is ever any legal question. He is aware of the situation and has been my counsel on this matter. He is a trustworthy man, despite appearances. There is one more practical thing I want to say, and then I will say the thing I actually want to say, which is the harder part. The telescope. Keep it. It is not valuable in the way valuable things are usually valued, but it is the instrument through which I saw most of the things that mattered to me. I want it to go on being used. I want someone to keep pointing it at things that deserve to be looked at carefully. You are the right person for that. You are always the right person for that. Now the harder part, I am sorry that I was not better at saying, while I was alive, the things I am saying here. I was a private man in ways that were sometimes unkind, and the result was that people who deserved to feel certain of my regard were sometimes left uncertain. You were one of those people. You should not have had to wonder. You were my best companion in my old age, and the hours we spent on that cold terrace naming stars were among the finest hours I had. You made me remember what I went into the mountains to remember, which was that the world is enormously larger and more interesting than any single life's portion of it, and that the right response to that fact is attention and gratitude, not ambition. I hope the house serves you well. I hope the valley gives you what it has given me. I am proud of you, Sera. I was always proud of you. I should have said it louder. All my love, your grandfather. I sat on the stone hearth for a long time after I finished reading. The fire was unlit and the room was cold, but the stone at my back had a deep, retained warmth from afternoons of sun through the south-facing windows. And I leaned into it and let the letter rest in my lap and let myself be still. Gil, who had moved discreetly to look at the kitchen, came back and stood in the doorway of the main room without speaking. He was good at that, at being present without being intrusive. My grandfather had chosen well in the people he trusted to maintain things. He said you'd know what to do, Gil said eventually. He said that about the telescope, I said. It turned out to be true. It usually did, Gil said. With him. I looked around the room, at the stone fireplace and the high ceiling, and the 12-paned windows that framed the meadow and the darkening sky above the tree line. I thought about my brothers in Whitmore's office, their cufflinks and their legal pads, the careful neutrality with which they had not looked at me when my inheritance was read. I did not feel angry at them. I noticed that absence with some surprise, as if I had reached into a pocket and found it empty when I expected weight. I felt something more like pity, and even that felt generous. They had gotten exactly what they came for, and what they came for was what they had always understood the world to offer. Numbers. Assets. Things with legible valuations. They had not thought to look through the telescope because it had not occurred to them that anything important might require looking at carefully. That was not malice, it was limitation, and it was not my problem to solve. My grandfather had spent 37 years maintaining a house in a hidden valley in the Blue Ridge Mountains, waiting for the grandchild who would think to climb a ridge and aim the lens at the coordinates. I did not intend to repay that patience with anything less than my full attention. The next weeks moved with the focused energy of someone who has been handed a purpose after a long time of not having one. I met with Whitmore, who was, as my grandfather promised, a man of quiet integrity behind the professional surfaces. He walked me through the holding company transfer with thorough patience, answering every question I had and anticipating the ones I hadn't thought to ask yet. The fund my grandfather had established was not dramatic. It was calibrated precisely to the ongoing costs of maintaining the property through a range of economic conditions. He had thought about it the way he thought about everything, not to impress, but to make it work. I paid off the last of my student loans in a single transaction. I sat at my kitchen table afterward and looked at the confirmation number on the screen for a while. It was the first time in 3 years that a number had not been waiting somewhere to reduce whatever I had. Then I drove back up to Halverson Point and spent a long afternoon cleaning the telescope, as my grandfather had taught me, with the lens tissue and the correct solution in the precise technique he'd demonstrated the summer I was 12 years old. When it was done, I set it up on the stone terrace in the dark and looked at things. Saturn was up. I found it on the second sweep and adjusted the focus until the rings were sharp and clear and unmistakable, hanging out there in the nothing with that serene indifference that large, cold things have. I thought about my grandfather looking at the same planet through the same eyepiece on nights when I was elsewhere and didn't know he was here. I stayed out until past midnight. It was cold enough that my breath came in plumes, and the stars over the ridgeline were very clear, the Milky Way a smear of concentrated light from south to northeast. I did not think about my brothers or the will reading or the laughter that had been carefully swallowed in Whitmore's office. I thought about the house in the valley and what it was going to require of me. I made a list in my field journal, in the dark, by feel, the way my grandfather had taught me to note things without breaking my eyes away from the eyepiece. The list was long and practical and detailed, and it was the best list I had ever made in my life. My brothers called within the month, not together, separately, which was somehow more telling. Declan first, his voice carrying the modulated warmth he deployed for difficult conversations, telling me he had heard I was spending time up at Halverson Point and asking very generally whether I was doing all right. I understood the question beneath the question. He had found out, or suspected, or heard something, and he was testing the temperature before committing to a position. "I'm very well," I told him. "The mountain air suits me." A pause. "Grandfather leave you anything else?" Whitmore was pretty tight-lipped about the whole holding company situation. "He left me exactly what I needed," I said, which was true and which answered nothing, and which I thought was the most honest thing I could offer. Another pause. "Right." And then, "Well, if you need anything." The sentence ended there, offered without a conclusion, and I thanked him for calling and said goodbye. Callum called 4 days later. He was more direct, which was more like him, and I respected it more. He told me flatly that he had done some research and had found references to a holding company associated with my grandfather's name, and that he wanted to know if there was an asset he and Declan had not been made aware of. "There is," I said. "Is it significant?" "To me," I said. "Yes, very." "Eleanor," he began, and I let him use the name he'd always used for me, the one nobody else used, because this was a hard conversation and he was trying. If grandfather withheld an asset from the estate, he didn't withhold it from the estate, I said. He never put it in the estate. It was never yours. It was always mine. He just waited until the right moment to give it to me. The silence that followed had a different quality than the one in Whitmore's office. That silence had been comfortable, the silence of people who had already won. This one was an adjustment, a recalibration, the sound of a man updating his model of a situation that turned out to be different than he assumed. "What is it?" he asked. "A house," I said. "In the mountains, in a valley you can only see from one place." "What's it worth?" I had known he would ask that. I didn't feel angry about it. "I don't know," I said, which was not entirely true. I had a rough idea from the assessment Whitmore had arranged, and I'm not planning to find out any time soon. I'm planning to live there. Another silence. "Right," he said, the same word Declan had used, with the same flat, recalibrated quality. "Well, good for you then." And I believed that he meant it, in his way, not generously but honestly. Callum was not a malicious man. He was a man who had sorted the world into categories a long time ago, and I had simply turned out to be in a different category than he'd assumed. That wasn't my problem to solve either. I moved into the house in the valley in April, when the meadow was coming back, and the black bears were beginning to move in the eastern woods, and the creek on the north side was running high and cold with snowmelt. I brought the telescope. I set it up on the broad stone porch the first evening, aimed it northeast toward Halverson Point, toward the ridge where I had stood, and aimed it in the opposite direction, and seen this place for the first time through the eyepiece. And I thought about sightlines, about how the act of looking is always mutual, in a sense, about how my grandfather had built this place in a hidden valley and then spent 30 years sitting on a ridge miles away, knowing it was there, and had spent every summer teaching me to look at things carefully enough that one day I would be the kind of person who knew where to point a telescope. The sky came on over the ridgeline in slow stages, the way it always does in the mountains, and the first stars appeared in the east, while the west was still a fading smear of orange and rose. I adjusted the bearing and the elevation by hand, as he had taught me, and found the first thing I was looking for on the third sweep. I stayed out until the mountain cold drove me inside, and then I made a fire in the stone fireplace and sat in front of it with my field journal and wrote down what I had seen. The handwriting was mine, but the habit was his, and the house was mine, and the sky outside was mine in the way that a view becomes yours when you have taken the time to learn it. My name is Sera Voss. I am 21 years old. I own 240 acres of the Blue Ridge Mountains, a house built from stone quarried by a man who believed that things should last, and a brass telescope through which my grandfather once looked at things that mattered and decided, with the quiet deliberateness that characterized everything he did, to teach me to look at them too. My brothers have their fortune. I have mine. And mine can see the stars.